Economia vem depois?
Essa aqui é a Marmota Jazz. E a mediação agora deste painel vai ser do Fabrício Scolari, diretor financeiro do IEE. Fabrício, por favor, suba ao palco, uma salva de palmas ao Fabrício. Já podem observar aqui, vamos recebê-lo com bastante palmas. John Cochrane, por favor, uma salva de palmas ao John Cochrane. Economista americano, autor do blog Grumpy Economist e participante do podcast Good Fellows do Instituto Hoover. Ele é especializado em política monetária e teoria fiscal do nível de preços e autor de artigos e livros como o elogiado Asset Pricing. Foi professor de finanças na Escola de Negócios da Universidade de Chicago. Tem destacado em seus artigos recentes a inflação, a dívida americana e os impactos financeiros trazidos pela Covid-19. Por favor, Fabrício, é contigo. Vamos embora.
Boa tarde. Durante o recente período pandêmico do Covid, tivemos um congelamento completo de todos os aspectos das nossas vidas, seja na nossa vida pessoal, como na profissional. Se pensarmos em termos macro, vimos governos sem uma resposta inicial prática e a população com muito receio do futuro, especialmente quando a economia em si estava totalmente parada. Esta inércia causou danos graves à economia de vários países. Tanto no campo econômico, como no político e sanitário, tivemos uma multiplicidade de respostas dadas, muitas sendo completamente tolhidas pelos governantes. Mas seriam elas descabidas? Seriam as ações adotadas pelos governos benéficas para a economia? E mais importante, a população se sente receosa em manifestar sua opinião ao discordar das medidas adotadas? Para debater essas e outras perguntas, temos conosco o professor John Cochrane. Este painel será mediado em inglês. Hello, professor. Welcome to the Fórum da Liberdade. We will proceed with a 30-minute talk and then open for Q&A. Professor, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. This is a great pleasure and a great honor. I don't think I can do anywhere near as well as that last panel. That was good. And I saw Neil Ferguson is coming tomorrow, so I'm even more worried about the competition, but I'm from Chicago, so we like competition. I'm so sorry not to be with you in person. That's one of the disadvantages of COVID. I've never been to a conference with a jazz band and such a good one as an interlude. A real pleasure that I am missing. But let's get right to work. I'm the grumpy economist, and you brought me here to be grumpy, so let's be grumpy. And I brought some slides to show you because after 30 years as a business school professor, I can't find my way out the door without slides. So let me show you some slides and pictures to keep this project going. Now, sorry, I have to rearrange things over here. So I'll title my talk a tipping point. And I want to think not so much about COVID. COVID was a big learning experience, and I'm very worried that our governments have not learned. And in fact, we have a tendency to enshrine as holy all the mistakes made last time and go ahead and make them again. COVID was the fire drill for worse pandemics to come, and I think we failed it impressively. Imagine the next pandemic has a more historically typical death rate of 5 or 10% rather than less than 1%. The completely incompetent response we saw would be much more tragic. But we're not here to talk about COVID today. I came here to talk about where we are now, and I believe we are at a big tipping point in the international economy, the US economy, and our world in general. One of the things bringing on the tipping point is inflation. So I brought up a graph, my first graph here. Somebody chat with me if you can't see the graphs or if there are video and audio problems, okay? I will assume everything's going okay otherwise. Here is a US inflation, and you can see starting just about January 2021, a sharp rise in inflation up to 8%. You can see it's not just coming back from the recession. This is a sharp, sustained, and increasing inflation with chances of it keeping going. The rumors are next month might be as high as 10%. I try not to talk too much about the US, but I only know the US, so I'm sorry I can't tell you too much about Brazil. But here's Brazilian inflation, as long as you guys are pretty much having exactly our experience, except plus 2% this time around. And you have much more experience with inflation that Americans should pay a lot more attention to. But it's a global, we are now in a global inflation as it was in the 1970s. Everybody except Japan seems to be having inflation now. And this is a history of inflation. So my thesis is that this inflation, which is just starting, is a signature moment, a tipping point, and it will painfully wash away lots and lots of bad ideas. So let me tell you some of those bad ideas and the hard process of washing them away. The first question, of course, is will it continue? Inflation tends to bring about lots of technical issue about the central bank's interest rates and monetary policy. That's, I think, the small part of it. I really want to focus on the long run, the inflection point of global economy and politics. But let's start a little bit on the small part. Will this inflation continue or not? The fact is, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank are way behind the curve here. And that's what this graph is trying to show you. If you can see my little arrow, the federal funds rate is stuck at 0 and inflation has gone up to 8%. Even in the 1970s, interest rates moved 1-for-1 with inflation. There was never a period of waiting for a year before doing anything about inflation. And of course, the 1970s are characterized as the period of far too slow a response. So from that traditional point of view, we're in real trouble. No, it's an open question. Will, in fact, the slowness of central banks cause inflation to accelerate? I think this is a likely scenario that we will do this, something like this, and then it will be followed with something like this, a period of very high interest rates and a recession. That certainly is the standard view, Larry Summers and John Taylor. There's reasons to question it, but that's, as you worry, repeating this is a scenario I think that we should keep in mind, especially because of how very late the central banks have been to move. Here is the Federal Reserve's projections. They don't see anything like that coming. And a big puzzle is why not? Here is their path for interest rates gently rising. Their path for inflation gently goes away all on its own. No period of interest rates much higher than inflation to get rid of that inflation. No period like this. Multiple years of a recession and high interest rates to slowly get rid of inflation. They seem to think that unemployment will just stay where it is, will not go high. Inflation will melt away on its own with no period of high interest rates. That's quite a puzzle. No, they're pretty smart people. Maybe they're right, but I think that is one of our big questions for today. Here's I made a graph of the standard view, trying to, what's going to happen. The standard view says that our current, this is I did a little model that incorporates the standard economic model where inflation much higher than interest rates is a negative real rate of interest, and that will lead to booming explosive inflation until central banks give up and get rid of it. Are central banks just dumb? No, there is a new view, the new Keynesian model. In the dashes, I have those central bank forecasts. In the solid lines, I had a little model that I ran. This is, those of you who do this stuff, the standard rational expectations Woodford new Keynesian model, which does say inflation will slowly melt away all on its own. Well, maybe, maybe not, but you should be pretty nervous, is what I'll say. There's an open, it's not a guaranteed. Standard wisdom says that this is our situation and we're in trouble. The Fed seems to believe this and we're not in trouble. Either could happen. Now, let's get to more serious questions. Where did this come from? Why are we having this period of inflation? Now, there's a lot of talk about supply shocks. And even if that is true, what it tells us, the main point of my talk, is that 99% of what I want to have to say occurs even if it's just supply shocks, because it tells us supply is finite. We have run into the economy's supply limit. As long as there's inflation, that's where we are. The economy is limited by supply, not demand. More stimulus will do no good. Only more supply will do any good. But I think there's a clear cause for this for this inflation, and that is too much demand. If people weren't trying to buy stuff, there wouldn't be supply constraints. And in fact, a supply shock can raise one price relative to another. If there's a supply shock that's hard to get TVs to the ports, the price of TVs goes up. But the price of restaurants, houses, and wages does not go up. The fact is that we're having inflation throughout the economy tells you that this is demand, not supply, not a supply shock, if we will. Demand that is pushing the economy up against its supply limits. During the COVID event, here we are, this is the US government, raised the total amount of debt by 30%. Here's debt, and here is M2, a measure of the money supply. What the US government did is literally printed about $3 trillion worth of money, borrowed another $2 trillion worth of money, and sent people checks. Milton Friedman called that a helicopter drop, and it is having exactly the effect that you would expect of a helicopter drop. Now, the key part of a helicopter drop is that it comes from a deficit, not from open market operations, and that people don't expect all that debt will be paid back. If people thought, oh, big debt today, but taxes are coming tomorrow, they hold on to that debt. People have lost faith that the government is going to repay this massive expansion of debt. So that's certainly where we came from, and that adds to our vision of where we are. Not only is the economy now at its supply limit, so that further stimulus does no good whatsoever. All spending has to be repaid by taxes. And furthermore, it's clearly where we came from is to excessive fiscal expansion. So that changes, this situation changes everything. First of all, let's look at fiscal policy. I've graphed here our current situation of US debt, big expansion in the recession, big expansion in the pandemic. And then I graphed a little more speculative because, of course, nobody expected this to happen. In the next crisis, we will surely borrow or print another $10 trillion. That's where debt's going. And here is US deficits, a steady 5% of GDP, if nothing bad happens. And when the next crisis happens, which may already be happening starting in Ukraine, we will have more. This is simply unsustainable. And I think this is a large reason why people are losing faith in US government debt. Now, what does this tell us? I was here to tell you about bad ideas washed away. Let us start with modern monetary theory. The theory that the government can print money or borrow money or hand it out, and that will never cause inflation because, quote, there is always slack in the US economy, unquote. That's Stephanie Kelton. Well, we just found the limits of slack in the US economy. That really, that was kind of a fringe view, although much as I like to make fun of it. But there was a much more establishment point of view. Olivier Blanchard, Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, that fiscal expansion can come with no fiscal cost. The government can borrow money and never worry about paying it back because interest costs were very low. It's painless to borrow, even if not completely free to borrow. That's over. If it ever was, a 1% interest rate less than growth rate does not finance 5% of GDP deficits. So it already was not the case, but now absolutely clearly not the case. More fiscal expansion must be paid for with taxes now or later. Taxes hurt the economy. More spending without taxes will just give us more and more inflation. We must spend wisely. We must reform to a sustainable budget. What does that mean? For example, that really changes our ideas. In every crisis, we reach to bailout. In the financial crisis, our government printed up and borrowed trillions of dollars to bail out the banks to offer stimulus in the trillions. In the COVID crisis, it bailed out, it offered stimulus in more trillions. We all warned it must end. There comes a point where investors won't hold the extra trillions. We just got to that point. The bailout regime is over. A new crisis will come. And in fact, we may be in one right now. I don't like to be pessimistic, but it could happen. We could have a worse pandemic, but right now it's quite possible that this war could get much bigger. That China invades Taiwan, the Middle East explodes, Putin lobs a nuke somewhere in Ukraine, and we're in a real shooting war. Now what happens? That would lead to an immense financial crisis. We're cutting off all the trade in Asia. We're cutting off energy. Stocks are going to plummet. What does our government do? We reach for the stimulus weapon. We reach to that well of borrowed and printed money, but the stimulus well just ran dry. So the idea that we can all run a very leveraged financial system and count on the Fed to bail us all out in crisis, that is really going to come up against that hard wall. We're at the inflation limit. The US doesn't realize this, of course, nor does Europe. We still spend money as if there's no cost to spending money. The US just once again postponed student loan repayment. Apparently, a democracy cannot ask its citizens to repay loans made by the government. And all of our governments are responding to inflation by subsidies. The US wants to pass the Build Back Better plan, the Biden administration, and to cut gasoline taxes. In other words, to respond to the increasing costs of goods and services by borrowing or printing money and then helping people to pay for those services. Europe is deep into this as well, already subsidizing energy and higher energy costs. From where? From more borrowed or printed money. Well, of course, when inflation comes from borrowed and printing money, borrowing and printing more to subsidize more and more goods is an unstable feedback loop. And here we go. The bailout, the subsidy regime, that has to end. We have to start spending money as if it matters, because it does matter. There's a larger, the biggest economic problem really we have, going back a little bit, is the growth slowdown. So here I put real domestic GDP per capita in the US, and you can see it's the most important thing about economics is growth. I do inflation in banks because that's what I know something about, but we should all be doing growth theory. The US grew from about $15,000 per capita to about $60,000 per capita over the post-war period. Just an amazing increase in standards of living. But you can see this growth rate is slowing down. These are in logs, so steady growth rate is linear. That growth rate is slowing down. This is a tragedy. To show you how much it's slowing down, I put some trend lines. The blue trend line here says, what if the growth rate from 1945 to 1969, what if it had continued? The red line says, well, the lower growth from 1970 to 2000, what if it has continued? And you can see that since 2000, growth has been even slower. This growth slowdown has cost us GDP per capita in 2022 dollars is about $71,000. It should be 86 if only we kept the somewhat slow growth from the 70 to 2000 going. It should be 103 if we were growing at the original post-war growth rate. These are big numbers. There's nothing in economics like giving $30,000 to every single person in the United States. And that's not just about buying more stuff. You want to pay for healthcare, you want to pay for Social Security, you want to pay for pensions, you want to pay for the environment, you want to pay for cleaner air. $30,000 a piece makes an enormous difference. That is our economic tragedy. And the question whether that will keep going, where did that come from? And will it keep going? To make it, this next graph, this is in levels, not logs, so you can see the magic of exponential growth, and that 86 and 103 really is a lot more than 70. And the question for our time, for our children and grandchildren, is will this continue? So this graph simply shows you growth at 1%, growth at 2%, or growth at 3%, starting at 70, until the magic year 2100. I picked that a little bit to make fun of climate people, because that's the day we talk about climate change. Well, 1, 2, or 3% growth makes per capita means the 70 growing to 156, 347, or 772. Just nothing else comes close to that difference if you're thinking about the world in the year 2100. And one of the many ideas that's going to have to get at least some sanity is climate policy. And to bring that to the fore, the little lines here, the IPCC's worst case scenarios say climate change is going to cost us 5% of GDP in the year 2100. Well, this knocks down all those by 5% of GDP. Well, climate change does knock things down a little bit, but climate change in terms of human prosperity and welfare, it is nothing like the question, does growth go back to what it used to be, or does it slow down even more? That is the most important. Growth, now, Brazil has a different problem. Here's the US versus Brazil and Japan. For the US, the question is that the leading country, sclerosis. Why is growth sclerotic in the US? But you can see the experience of Japan and South Korea was catch-up growth. The US has to innovate or reform or do something. We have to find better ways of doing things. Other countries have to learn how to do things only as inefficiently as the US. And South Korea is the poster child for catch-up growth. So I'm sad to see Brazil starting to catch up and now not catching up. But certainly the challenge for Brazil is why is this happening and not that happening? And that's a different challenge, I think. Well, I think it's actually the same. I think the US is having some of Brazil's malaise at a higher level. We have to pay attention to supply. So growth is the issue. What have we just learned? There was a big question, an honest question from the year 2000. Was this secular stagnation, endless lack of demand, needing only more fiscal stimulus to get us going? Well, you can argue about it. We just learned the lesson. We just did the fiscal stimulus. We just got the inflation. We hit the supply constraints. It was not secular stagnation, it's supply. Supply policy is horrible for politicians. Demand policy is, I'm going to print money and give everyone checks. Yay, vote for me. Supply policy is tiny. It's you have to take Marie Kondo to your national life. You have to fix zoning. You have to fix building restrictions. You have to fix environmental suits that allow too many points of vetoes. You have to fix the fact that in the US, it takes 10 years to get the permits to do anything, even to put in solar panels. Those are hard problems, but that's where we are. Energy is now just a graph to keep you thinking about energy. As you know, oil prices have skyrocketed. Natural gas prices are especially skyrocketing. The inflation and the war are starting. There is a tipping point here, and I think we are hopefully realizing it, but the battle is on. The United States and the European Union have been on an absurd energy policy trajectory involving ridiculously expensive decarbonization. Now, climate change is real, and we have to do something about it. But our current policy has been to subsidize fancy electric cars for middle-aged men who live in Palo Alto at very little benefit to the climate and enormous costs. Windmills and solar, and above all, to stop US domestic and European domestic fossil fuel development before alternatives were available at scale. While China and India build coal plants like there's nothing going on. This energy policy, Europe has just woken up that this was a horrible idea, but not yet to the fact they need to allow fracking. Natural gas is the transition fuel. They need to allow nuclear power. Germany still can't do that. This battle is still going on in the United States. Since our legislatures will never pass something like that, the peasants with pitchforks would be up in arms about it. But financial regulation is being subverted to defund fossil fuel. And of course, the surge in oil prices has just put the lie to the whole thing. The idea was that, the transition is going to make oil companies bankrupt. Well, sorry, the transition is going to give huge profits to oil companies because it's going to make the price of oil go up. When you don't allow development of oil, what happens? Oil prices go up or down? Econ 101 quiz. They go up. So war and inflation and price spike have revealed just how empty this is. There is no just huge money. You can't waste money on this sort of stuff. In an economy with a labor shortage and with inflation, millions of green jobs. Bernie Sanders said the transition would give us 20 million green jobs. Those are now a cost, not a benefit, because we don't have 20 million workers. Turning off nuclear power is a gigantic mistake. We have to get to a serious energy policy, along with serious supply side policies on everything. Tariffs, immigration. If you have a labor shortage, well, let people in. The problem is, of course, all of those have entrenched political constituencies, and in climate, almost a religious constituency that doesn't want to just. I'm not arguing for anything that isn't in the IPCC reports, but we got to stop pretending and do something that at least hits a cost-benefit analysis. I'll close my comments with we are in a sort of a deeper economic and political moment. This is a tipping moment. All of these nostrums have hit the brick wall in inflation. We're now in a shooting war in Ukraine, but we're not shooting. And the big question is, will the West fight? Do we believe in liberal democracy? Or does any dictator just say, I might have nuclear weapons and get what he wants? What will China and Iran take from the current situation? Will we next have China invading Taiwan, Iran exploding the Middle East? Certainly the fecklessness of our foreign policy is coming to roost. Does the West believe in itself enough to be serious? That's a geostrategic tipping point. And we're at a political tipping point. What I've shown you it's not hard. An economics, this group could sit together and come up with a reform plan that will fix our government budgets, vastly increase supply, get Brazil growing again to catch up with the US, and the US growing again like it used to in World War II. We could do that this afternoon. But of course, this is politically difficult because so many people benefit from the current system. But it needs a government, a sage government capable of reform. US politics, I hate to tell you, is also at a tipping point. I fear we are heading to a constitutional crisis. It's beyond just partisanship. We've been yelling at each other for 200 years, but it's beyond partisanship. Our government has moved to a winner-take-all mentality, and consequently, when winners take all, you fight by any means. Winner take all is now, you win by a tiny electoral majority and then just pass a bunch of executive orders undoing what your predecessor did. It was funny, back when Chicago used to alternate between Irish and German mayors, the first thing a German mayor would be to ban the sale of whiskey and re-legalize the sale of beer. The first thing an Irish mayor would do would be to ban the sale of beer and reinstitute the sale of whiskey. But simply undoing the entire administrative state by executive order every time you take over is dangerous. And what it's leading to is fight by any means. The real danger is now we fight our politics by denying the legitimacy of the winner. This is most obvious to you if you followed the Trump's abominable behavior in refusing to admit he lost the election. But Trump led at best a bunch of yahoos who wear horned hats and no shirts as they're rioting in the Capitol. Hillary Clinton's response to the loss was similar, to deny the legitimacy of Trump, and an entire movement that called itself the Resistance, Not My President, that bought the Russian collusion hoax. And that one had the FBI, the Department of Justice, media, universities, all the institutions of civil society behind its effort. The Biden administration is laying the groundwork to proclaim the next loss of an election the result of racist voter suppression. Just this week, they're toying with the idea of simply ignoring the Supreme Court on the grounds that the Supreme Court is political. This leads to constitutional crisis at a time when you need bipartisan long horizon reform. We need to return to rules and norms, to regular order, or we will fall apart. And certainly we need to do that if we're going to have the kind of long-term policy that is needed to solve our economic problems. So I wish I could end on a more positive note, but we're at a tipping point, economically, politically. Let us hope we come out the right way. But tipping points are chances. We've been at a lot of the self-delusions have been going on for 10 or 20 years. I think current inflation and war bring clarity to those. Europe has woken up quickly and partially, if quickly, and is starting to rethink how it views defense, energy, not quite yet government budgets. Hopefully that will come to the US as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cochrane. I'll go for the first question. I would like to go back a little bit to the beginning when you mentioned a lot of the stimuli that the governments use to increase demand. So we see many COVID policies as well as government policies regarding stimuli. They're supposed or branded to be temporary. But as Milton Friedman once said, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. So are there any policies that could be considered good, or are they just a bomb about to blow? And if so, how can we defuse them?
Yeah, I think our government especially made a fundamental mistake, our Treasury and Fed, in analyzing the COVID recession as a classic lack of demand recession, like 2008, and meeting it with bailout and stimulus. Now, the financial markets were on edge. Now, just why, after all the promises of regulation, we had to come in and bail out simple things like money market funds again is a good question that nobody is having the decency to ask. But after that, we met the COVID recession with stimulus as if it was lack of demand, but it wasn't. It was, restaurants were not closed because nobody had the money to go out. They were closed because they were closed. Nobody wanted to go to get sick, and the governments had locked them down. It was, well, my analogy for US listeners is a giant snowstorm. There must be something like that. You don't have snow, but there must be something like it, which is why it came back so quickly. So first of all, I think it was a mistake in thinking that the economy needed stimulus. Now, it certainly needed insurance. People who were, this is a fine function, people who were really hard hit, lost their jobs, there's a function for insurance. But we gave checks to every single, I'd like to say every single registered voter, but in fact, we gave checks to a lot of people who weren't registered voters. The idea that you needed to keep it going. So I think that was a first big mistake, which is why we got into trouble for what you're saying next. Then yes, in the US, we passed rent. Nobody has to pay the rent and can't get evicted. The state of California still cannot bring itself to say, you gotta start paying the rent or get evicted. And student loans are another example. Can you ever take these stimuli off? Some of them do come off. Unemployment insurance, that is time limited and eventually does go away. But people, sir, you're right. People are certainly get used to that. But much of that stuff is, in fact, slowly but surely ending. I think the larger question is the greater and greater expansion of social programs, and the U.S. particularly poorly designed social programs with bad incentives that keep people on those forever. That's past the COVID thing. That's just sort of the structural problem of U.S. badly designed social programs.
Thank you. Another picture that that I understood that you painted is that regarding inflation and interest rates, where central banks are kind of sleeping on the wheel, where inflation is rising and interest rates just keep being so low. But what role does the political risk plays in this scenario? Do you believe that by raising interest rates, it could cause a recession? So the political risk or politicians pressure it to keep it down?
Yes. Now let me be a little more. So why are they so slow to raise interest rates? As is true in the 1970s, raising interest rates. The problem is you're trying to fight a fiscal inflation with monetary policy. The inflation is not the Fed's fault. The inflation came from fiscal policy, and now we're asking monetary policy to contain it. It's sort of like if the driver of the car has his foot on the accelerator, we're asking the Fed to drain the oil out in order to slow the car down. It's not an ideal way to slow the car down. Fixing fiscal policy would be that fixes the ultimate cause of the problem. But they are slow, and they're slow for a number of reasons. One is they got into this forward guidance trap. They promised to keep interest rates low kind of forever to stimulate the economy back a couple of years ago to fight deflation. Well, having made that promise, if they turn around instantly, people aren't going to believe them again. So I think they are in part saying, oh, we made these promises, we can't jump. I think they are also our Fed has become much more sensitive to inequality and that sort of thing. And so it is the idea of causing a recession, which would cause unemployment, would be deeply unpopular at the Fed. And the Fed isn't that independent. Congress would explode if the Fed really raised interest rates and if that started causing unemployment. And now we have fiscal problems too. In 1980, the debt to GDP ratio was 25%. Now the debt to GDP ratio is 100%. If the Fed raises interest rates 5%, that's going to be a 5% of GDP additional deficit to pay the interest costs on the debt. Where's that money going to come from? So the Fed needs to raise interest rates. They need to go to Congress and say, by the way, we're going to cause some unemployment to start to tamp down this inflation. By the way, that's going to hurt the vulnerable and the poor more than everybody else. By the way, you also need to start tightening fiscal policy by $1 trillion a year to pay the higher interest costs on the debt. That is going to be a very difficult conversation. I think the Fed knows that. So yes, there's taming inflation by raising interest rates is going to be very, very difficult if we try it, harder than it was last time.
Thank you, Professor. Also, the way we see this past 2 years, there was a huge increase in government spending, increasing even more the debt versus GDP ratio. And you also mentioned a lot about the confidence of paying off that debt. So my question is a little bit broad, but how does this end eventually?
Well, that's there's a bunch of constraints. So we know one of the possible ways, right? Either we pay off the debt, we inflate away the debt, which wouldn't really help because the big problem isn't just the debt. The big problem is that the U.S. has made promises that it cannot keep about future Social Security and Medicare issues. So even inflating away the debt won't let you pay the continuing 5% of GDP deficits that we have. So it has to end. The bright way for it to end is a supply-oriented policy that gets the economy growing like crazy. Because then you make a lot of tax revenue without having to raise tax rates. Then the expenditures you have to make, since everybody's doing better and better on their own, social expenditures decline, and you kind of have a happy end to it. Plus, reform the programs to get rid of the horrible disincentives. That's the happy way out. The less happy way out is a debt crisis. A moment when a crisis comes, the U.S. tries to borrow, people say, we're done with it, demand much higher interest rates, and now you have to solve the problems all of a sudden in a crisis. That leads to a sharp inflation, maybe even a default, along with a financial crisis and a recession. I hope that doesn't happen, but that is certainly a possibility. And Americans are so insular. We don't look at your history. We don't look at a lot of history. We just think, oh, that could never happen here. But economic mechanisms are the same the world over. I mean, I gather in Brazil, you had an inflation, you tried to raise interest rates, but you didn't solve the fiscal problem, and the inflation just got worse. That could happen in the U.S. A rollover crisis could happen in the U.S. And I said default. Let's get to a real crisis moment, and we're going to Congress and saying, well, are you going to raise taxes and cut spending on needy Americans, or are you going to pay interest costs on the debt to fat cat Wall Street people? That's not obvious to me that we wouldn't have some sort of debt crisis as well.
Thank you, Professor. Going a little bit deeper on the part that you mentioned, incentives. Do you feel that the government or politicians make use of the public's lack of economic knowledge to pass down policies and legislation that on paper may sound good and are publicized as being good for the economy, good for the population, but in reality create bad externalities as well as bad incentives for the population as a whole? How do we change this scenario if the answer is yes?
Well, the difference, I think, between an economist and a politician and our political system, this is the big one. If you're an economist and you're honest about it, what we know about is incentives. We know how to analyze these incentives. We really have no expertise on who should get what. When we look at taxes, we should be looking at, well, what's the disincentive? We look at a social program, we shouldn't be trying to moralize about who's deserving, who's undeserving. We should be thinking about, if you earn an extra $1, do we take away $2 worth of benefits? That's a problem. Think about incentives. That's what economists have to offer. Of course, politics is all about taking money from A and giving it to B. So that's certainly what motivates politicians. Now, how do we get a better public discussion? Saying no more economics isn't really going to help because most economists once they start doing policy, act like politicians and get all excited about who should we take money from and who should we give money to, and forget that their main job is to think about incentives. So I think a better public discussion goes back to a more fundamental one about becoming a economy based on rights rather than permissions. I think that encodes a lot of better understanding of incentives. And it would certainly help to talk about incentives. And that's what I think people like us are there to do, to try to bend that public conversation away from who should get and who should, the moralistic thing, but to notice that anytime you take from A and give to B, that gives both A and B horribly bad incentives, and the whole size of the pie gets smaller.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question comes from the audience, from Gabriel Torres. Professor, if I was a very risk-taker economist, which I'm not, I would say your lecture serves as a case in favor of cryptocurrencies. What would that conclusion be right? What are the options still available to central banks to recover the dollar's value?
Crypto. Why did I know we'd have the crypto question? For the moment, cryptocurrencies are not the solution to the problem. The main thing that they offer is anonymity. Now, that's in one of the big tensions of public life. I think anonymity of transactions is a big one that we're going to have to face. Cash has this wonderful fact that it's anonymous. We need to move to digital payments, but if the government knows everything that you bought and sold, your economic as well as political liberty just went down the tubes, as the Canadian truckers just found out. The truckers staged a protest and the government seized their bank accounts. Imagine if the government watches and can kick you out of the financial system for everything you do. So crypto is mostly about anonymity. For the moment, crypto is not a way to establish a standard of value, its own standard of value. Bitcoin is sort of like gold. It fluctuates way too much. And the stable coins are, of course, defined, they just have reinvented the bank or the money market mutual fund. They promise to pay you dollars. So I think I would love it if we did not have to have an immense global hyperinflation and financial crisis to force us out of our current system, where governments are reasonably responsible and short-term government debt is a decent numeraire basis for a financial system. And then crypto can take its proper place as a good way of implementing financial context. For the moment, it hasn't done anything new financial. It's just reinvented the money market fund, maybe more efficiently than money market funds. And I hope it is a disruptive. Our financial system has been very monopolized, and our Federal Reserve doesn't allow narrow banks, innovative payment providers to come in and undermine the banks. So hopefully crypto will spark some revolution there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the technology of crypto. And with that, let's leave crypto alone and move on to something else.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, I was talking to a few friends at venture capitals, and they argue that there has been a huge productivity growth in the global economy, and that would be what's preventing the monumental money printing becoming 20-30% of inflation. What are your remarks on that hypothesis? Would you buy it?
Well, I don't see in the productivity numbers. So where has there been productivity growth? In the US, there's not, the growth slowdown I showed you is our productivity growth is slow. Brazil, basically, when you're looking over 10 to 20 years, all growth per capita comes from productivity growth, and our economies aren't growing that fast. China's economy grew like crazy from when they stopped being miserably poor to when they came up to sort of middle income status, and that is measured productivity. But it was certainly not the case that our economies are globally growing leaps and bounds, and that this increase in productivity is in some sense soaking up money. Where the money is being soaked up, people are willing to hold immense amounts of government debt and money as an investment vehicle on the faith that these will get paid back. And so it's going in, it's absorbing savings. It is not is not in some sense being absorbed by high productivity. Now, in fact, it's, if anything, low productivity. It's absorbing savings because private capital is not. There isn't great. There are not great productivity projects for you to lend money to private companies to invest in. So we're all lending it to the government instead. And that's all, you know, an investment in a private company is you're building a factory that's going to deliver something in the future. An investment in the government is you are taking a share of tax revenues that you hope will come in the future. Maybe or maybe not. Historically, government debt has been a very risky proposition. And if you look at our governments as a business plan, you're a venture capitalist. Look at the business plan of the United States government. Okay, we want to borrow, let's see, right now we're about $25 trillion. So roughly 5 years of our annual revenues we want to borrow. What's our plan for paying it off? None. Our plan is to keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and you throw them out of your office for that. This is where I worry about government debt. Where is there an immense amount of debt and no plan for paying it off? It's all rolled over short-term debt and shady accounting. One of the dangers we face, I think, is a global sovereign debt crisis. So kind of the opposite of what you said. I think lots and lots of productivity showing up in the actual productivity numbers is the answer. And there's plenty of room for that. The technical discoveries we have, especially in biosciences, are just fantastic. They need to get incorporated into what we do as an economy.
Thank you, Professor. Continue on with regarding investing. We see a lot of resources being placed in companies or enterprises with a negative cash flow, in the hopes that in the future that will somehow be paid off with profits. How much of it does it make sense, and how much of it is just excess cash going into pet projects?
I don't know. It's up to you to decide. Now, this is true of the big growth firms, the Teslas of the world. There are, the new technology companies are selling at astounding price earnings ratios, even if the earnings are positive, as you mentioned, and often those earnings are negative. What we do know historically is that in times of technical innovation like this, most of those high-flying companies eventually go bust or don't make money, but one or two of them do great. Even buying Amazon in the great tech bubble of the 1990s, well, that one worked out. Certainly if that's your strategy, have a very diversified portfolio, because it's hard to tell ahead of time which one is going to do well and which one is not. So those are very much the high flyers. I think also your comment, there's a lot of people always say, oh, U.S. investors are short-term. They only care about short-term profits. And I say, Tesla, Rivian. You look at, the big high flyers are in fact companies that aren't making any profits at all. And investors seem to have faith that 20, 30 years from now, those will be worth something. So at least it's nice to see some long-termism. That's the risky part of investment. And let's hope, one out of 10 of those should hopefully will make a lot. And so if you're going to do that, try to pick the right one and hold a very diversified portfolio.
Thank you, Professor. Now a question from the audience, from Tairine Ribeiro de Oliveira. What autonomous workers can do to incentivize positively the economy in an emerging country?
Help me better on what the translation of autonomous workers is. Independent
workers.
You mean independent contractors?
Exactly.
So one of the, my big preach is we need to free up the supply side of the economy. And most markets are very strangled and regulated, and no market more so than the labor market. The best example for most people who aren't labor market experts, you look at Uber versus the taxis. Uber came in and offered, independent contract status as opposed to employee status. That gets you around wage regulation, hours regulations, benefits regulations. You have to work 8-hour shifts. You can, all those other regulations, which people want. It was a boon for people who only work part-time, people who are free for 3 or 4 hours in the day, for women, for minorities, for new immigrants. My last 2 Uber drivers had just gotten here from Brazil, and they didn't speak English so well, and they had other things going on in their lives, and they wanted to be able to work when they wanted, didn't they want it? So it brought workers who wanted flexibility and cars that were sitting useless out, and got us all cheaper, better, much better rides than else. So that's an example of you can see that flexibility in labor contracting is tremendously advantageous. Our governments try to enforce this 1950s view of you work exactly 8 hours from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., no more, no less, with benefits and so forth, and you retire 40 years later with a gold watch. Well, that's just not efficient. That's not the market. That's not what people want. There is this view, see, governments are spending all their effort trying to transfer from A to B rather than trying to grow the whole thing. So there's this view that helps the worker at the expense of the company, which somehow has all sorts of money to give these workers. But you and I are not as well off as we are because our great grandparents who might have worked as workers on a farm negotiated a better deal. No, I'll get 5 cents a day, not 3 cents a day. We're better off because of a more dynamic economy that let us do efficient things. And the best labor protection is take this job and shove it, as the country song goes. In fact, a dynamic labor market with lots of opportunities lets people quit if they don't like the way they're being treated, which is what's going on in the US right now. The great resignation. People sick of their jobs are going on to other jobs. So independent contractor status versus labor status is one of the, I think one of the great useful ways of allowing flexibility in the labor force at the expense of the highly regulated, regimented jobs. Europe has had this problem, their traditional employment versus their precarious or informal employment. We just end up sanctifying a small number of jobs, and then you get an enormous number of unemployed people waiting to get one of those permanent benefit jobs. It's a system that leads to very slow growth. So yes, long version of that's one of the ways in which we need to free up the economy to let people chase opportunities better and flexibly respond to what markets have to offer.
Thank you, Professor. Regarding staying on the subject of labor force, we can see a sudden shift of the economy of being a goods economy towards a service economy. But no matter how much service we provide, we still need goods and someone to manufacture them. How do you see this division of labor force or labor occurring in the future?
Well, it's not obvious to me we do. Robots are making all the stuff now. You walk into a factory and see a great absence of people and presence of robots. So I think, in fact, it's in manufacturing, we have this. Only left-wing academics can sit in their ivory towers and say how wonderful it was when they were manufacturing jobs. If you actually spend any time in a manufacturing plant, those are awful jobs. Spending all day long putting one bolt on one nut, boom, 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 for the next 40 years of your life. Service jobs are much better. So I don't see anything wrong with a world in which robots make us the things we need, and we provide what humans can provide, which is to provide more and more complex and personal services to each other. Incidentally, it's if you worry about the environment, people say, how can GDP keep growing? We'll run out of resources and so forth. No, GDP keeps growing because it becomes not more stuff. I don't need 5 cars. I need 1 car and better healthcare, and a better tax attorney, and better services is one way in which we all actually become much more wealthy. Now, we're very much stuck in medieval economics. When the great transition to manufacturing happened from agriculture, everyone said, oh, this is terrible, this is terrible. Land and food are the only true value. All this stuff is useless. And now we say the same thing of the shift from manufacturing to services, but it's a wonderful thing. And it frees us from horrible toil and gives us imagine a wonderful world where basically stuff is free and you get paid for the services that you provide to other people, and we all live healthier, longer, happier lives. Great. Go services.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question comes from the audience, from Bruna Gonçalves Aguiar. She asks, if you were the president, wouldn't you make an emergency financial aid during the pandemic, just like the one we had in Brazil, for example, or the one we had in the US?
Absolutely. So, during a pandemic, it's a shock, and that is a time when the government reaches out and helps people who have been hurt. And if, as much as I rail against bailouts and so forth, if I'm president of the Fed, the chair of the Fed during that time, I bail out financial markets like everyone else. In the same way as, if you're at the head of the firehouse and there's a fire, you go put out the fire. Now, I would be much more attentive to spending money wisely, to helping people who actually got hurt and needed the help, and not just spreading it around willy-nilly. I certainly, that the sort of lockdowns and closures and the whole pandemic policy, I would have done differently. And I would then, in the retrospect, say, why did I have to do all that? And try to put the genie back in the bottle. If you're the fire department and you have to go put out a huge fire everywhere, and then you discover everybody's got gasoline tanks in the basement after the fact, not during the fact, after the fact, you say, guys, time to stop with the gasoline tanks in the basement. And our financial system has a lot of that. But absolutely, in a crisis, that is exactly the right time for the government to stay. If you want to defend it economically, you are providing ex post a kind of insurance, market completeness. There's a kind of insurance that did not exist ahead of time, and so you can't require that people have bought. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way. And you don't want a wave of needless bankruptcies. You got to ask, why did the companies so leverage that they were going to go bankrupt? Why does nobody have any cash reserves? Why is there nobody around to be the liquidity providers? Why do I have to do all the time? But in the crisis, you jump in and stop things.
Thank you, Professor. Continuing on the subject of the pandemic, is there something that we have learned after the COVID pandemic, especially in economics, that changed things for the better?
Oh. Gosh, you're hitting my grumpy economist wall. I'm all on the changing things for the worse. I would hope, some of the things, the fact of failures, I think, does lead to people learning. So many U.S. parents noticed via Zoom what a horrible education their children were getting, and that may be being cleaned up. I do think there's a huge failure. The summary of the failure of our COVID policy could be summarized as bureaucracy versus exponential growth. Our health policy establishment, interestingly, never figured out that in a period of exponential growth, when you're fighting a virus that's doubling every X, that the usual bureaucracy and waiting and so forth just is not tenable. So we've been kind of out of sync with that the whole time. I hope we've learned those lessons. So for example, I think lockdowns are a thing of the past, and the immense cost of the lockdown, and especially the school closure policy, I think people learned that was not a good thing, and we won't do it again. The slight worry, of course, is if the next pandemic has a 10% death rate, maybe lockdowns will be a good idea. So there's a sense in which I worry about us learning wrong lessons in both ways. I'll take suggestions. If your questioner wasn't X a good idea, maybe we can, maybe my lack of creativity here and my excessive grumpiness will be cured.
Thank you, Professor. Now I'll leave it to you to make your closing remarks as we're reaching the end of the panel.
Oh, boy, you've listened to me talk too much. If two things matter, I guess, is freedom and incentives. And that's the fact that that's what you care about as well as I care about is why I came to talk today. Don't be cynical. Ideas matter. We still do live in democracies. Those democracies, the institutions need. We live in democratic republics, not straight democracies. Those institutions need rebuilding and care. But opinion matters. Ideas matter. It's not just about whispering in the ear of and hoping some politician gets going. And the crucial ideas that matter are freedom and incentives, exactly what you're after. So this is great work that we are all doing, and keep it up.
Thank you so much for your time and your presence here at the Fórum da Liberdade, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a great honor and a pleasure. And I hope someday it's an in-person pleasure.
We hope as well. Thank you. Painel fechado.